So civil rights is a promise from the federal government to the citizens of the United States that there's a certain level of autonomy that comes with citizenship. So if you're a citizen, you can experience certain freedoms, and those freedoms are protected. And those freedoms would be, of course, the right to cast a vote, the right not to be picked up and held in custody and owned by somebody else. It is the protection of the federal government that you will experience the fulfillment of all of those promises in that Declaration of Independence that says all men are created equal, and then, of course, codified through those amendments that were adopted through Reconstruction. That is what civil rights affords us.
Then the government passed the Jim Crow laws and said these are the limits. A black person cannot do virtually anything at the same time or place that white people are doing those things. Eating, sleeping, walking, riding, anything. In Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court said a black man has no right that a white man is bound to respect. And they took that quite seriously.
So it's difficult to have a conversation about Plessy versus Ferguson without putting this in context. And to do that, we have to talk about Louis A. Martinet, who was an African-American attorney back in the 1800s. And he was the person who actually engineered the Plessy versus Ferguson strategy. So Plessy and Louis A. Martinet were part of the Citizens Committee. And Plessy was strategically selected as the person because it would be unclear as to whether he was really, in fact, a white man or a black man. So this was a test case that was well orchestrated and planned. But in terms of Plessy, to suggest that it would be okay for Louisiana to have a rail car law that would require people by complexion to be seated differently would undermine every promise of the 14th Amendment. And so this was a great disappointment to see the federal government essentially sanction this system of separating people by race, but just after they had given us this 14th Amendment and this false hope that we would be treated equally in the eyes of the law. But Plessy goes on after this decision to continue to be a part of the Citizens Committee, and he and Louis A. Martinet fight this thing called the Jim Crow jury. And that becomes very relevant to us today because it lays the groundwork for the non-unanimous jury challenge that we all just witnessed in November of 2018. But this Jim Crow jury takes form right around the time of Plessy in 1896-97. And what is happening at this point is that jury service is contingent on voter registration records. And so because we had just talked about the high numbers of African Americans who were voting, they were for the first time now being called to jury service. And so the fear was, if they're on these juries, we won't be able to rapidly convict. And if we can't rapidly convict, then this empire we've started, these plantations that we use for convict leasing, we won't have the bodies. And so our non-unanimous jury law is a product of that era. It was designed specifically in 1898 by looking at the voting registration records and doing the math and calculating based on this number of African American voters, we will likely see about 3 on juries. And so from 1898 until the year 2018, we operated with a system that diluted the voices of African Americans, and they would be the voices who oftentimes would raise reasonable doubt. And we would disregard those voices suggesting that there was reasonable doubt, and we would quickly convict. But this one law is the result of that. And this is not an accident. This is a willful design that was shaped during the Reconstruction era. A second one that has not yet fully been confronted is the issue of felony disenfranchisement. And in many states, if you are a convicted felon, you lose voting rights forever. Louisiana just changed our law in 2018. So after 5 years of freedom, you regain those voting rights. So it's important for us to understand historically, there's a connection to where we are presently and how our system was shaped and by whom. Because most of what we see in terms of justice and in terms of law, it was not done out of a design for ensuring the protections of the Declaration of Independence, which says all men are created equal. That was not the motivation. The motivation down south was how do we teach the federal government a lesson, which is that they're not going to defy our norms. And we're still struggling with that reality.